Okay. Can people view that?
Yeah.
Okay. Who do we have on the line? Let's see. Oh, we have a lot of people. Oh, wow. Great. Okay. All right. Rick, do you want to say anything, or should I start?
Yeah, just I wanna thank my brother Jack, is always a step ahead of the game, and regarding this especially, has been watching it early on and speaking to a lot of the world experts, and been in touch with our community leaders and leaders of other communities as well. So really want to thank him. I think he was one of the driving forces behind our schools becoming more aware and taking the steps early on, and really about early prevention and making sure everybody's safe. Thank you, Jack, for taking a few minutes. I know you're doing a lot of things today. Thanks for taking some time to educate us.
Yeah, no problem. It's been a very intense week for everybody on this call. Myself and many others have been working nonstop on behalf of the community to make sure that we have the best protection possible. It's a very difficult and challenging moment for us, but I'm actually feeling very empowered now, and others are feeling empowered as we gain more knowledge. And we've been able to access some of the countries and the world's key experts on epidemics. And so again, just to start off with, I am not an epidemic expert going into this, not a virologist going into this, but we've been very blessed to get to the right people who spent their lives not only being medical doctors, but dedicating their medical career to epidemic management. That is who we've gained this information from. And we've been able to glean it and put together the slide deck that I'll share with you, have them validate the slide deck, both from the science and presentation. They went through it slide by slide. These are people who are quoted in national media and have 25 years each in this area. And so we feel very blessed that we've been able to access their expertise, and I am really just a conduit for that today. Let me see if I can. Okay, great. Is it better for folks? Maybe I should make the slides a little smaller, because I know people have the video, right, as well. So let me just make it a little smaller here. All right. Can people see that? Is that all right? And what we can do is we can share the slide deck as well with the community. There's a lot of notes in it below, as you can see. There's links if you'd like to delve in further, if you want to read the original papers. Every slide is backed up by a source, and you could read the original paper so that you can get even deeper knowledge.
Yeah, keep it large. Large is better.
Keep it large? All right. And what people can do, if they have the Zoom on the right, they can move that around. If you click on the top of the Zoom, you can move that out of the way if it's in your way. Okay. So let's just first distinguish between the virus and the disease. The virus is now called SARS-CoV-2. The disease is called COVID-19. That's the disease you get from the virus. It's named SARS not because it has the exact same symptoms as SARS, and I'll talk about SARS in a few slides, but because genetically, it's clear that it came from a mutation of the SARS virus from 2003. If we look at the naming, it was initially called novel coronavirus 2019. On March 2nd, the committee that looks into these things changed it to the official name now, which is SARS-CoV-2. The virus is zoonotic. Think of the word zoo. It came from animals. This one came from the horseshoe bat in the Wuhan city of Wuhan in Hubei province in China. Talking to the geneticists who are focused on this particular virus, it's clear that it was basically one single transmission to a human, and that human that infected other humans. It went from bats via an intermediate animal to that particular human, and that human then spread it. How do we know that? Because they've been able to collect samples of the first 50 to 100 cases in Wuhan from that hospital, genetically sequence it, and compare them to each other. They're identical, meaning that in cases and viruses where there was multiple points of entry from animal to human, you would see some differentiation, some letters be different in the genetic code. However, that's not the case here. They are not fully aware right now of the animal that's between the bat and the human. Doesn't really matter right now, but just let you know where this came from. what is this virus? So the first part of this discussion will be what this virus is and how it affects its damage. We'll then get into what we are doing about it, what others are doing about it, what Israel's doing about it, and how one gets control of it. And finally, we'll get to vaccines and treatments. So first, let me start with what is this thing? This is a cross-section diagram on the left and an electron microscope on the right of this specific coronavirus. They all share basically the same underlying mechanism, which is that it's a sphere that actually is in the form of a icosahedron, so it's spherical, but it has slight sides to it. It has pins coming out, these spikes. These are the glycoproteins. We'll get to that in a second. Because of these spikes, it has this crown-like appearance. In Latin, crown is corona, just like the Spanish word, corona. And so that's why it's called the coronavirus. They all share this basic idea. It's a Trojan horse strategy that it takes. And you see the stuff inside that will do the damage, that red stuff that is coiled up. On the outside, it looks like something that the cell might want to accept. What are viruses? Just to start with that for a second. Viruses are not fully alive. To be alive, we need to have a genetic code and the ability to replicate that genetic code. A few other things as well. A virus has a genetic code, as we'll see, but does not have the ability to replicate its own genetic code. It needs a host cell. It is a parasite. It needs to find a host cell that has the ability to replicate genetic codes and then trigger the replication of its genetic code instead of the genetic code of the cell. That's the hijacking that it does. How does it do that? So here, we're going to focus on the right side. So if you have the Zoom video stuff, you can move that to the left side. What we see here is the capsid. That's just a fancy term for the enclosure that I just showed you before. The capsid is blue. The evil stuff that's about to hurt this person is the red strand. Technically speaking, what we call this particular virus is a plus-sense, single-stranded RNA virus. Let's break that down and understand what that is. There are multiple kinds of viruses. There are DNA viruses and RNA viruses. And let me first go to this slide as a recap from our high school days and college days as to how this works, and we'll come back to the previous slide. Our genes are made up of DNA, and DNA is made up of nucleotides or bases. These are letters. We can think of them as letters. ATCG is the genetic code in our DNA, and AUCG is the code in an RNA. We start with the DNA. The analogy I use is the Hechal from the Tanakh. We have the Kodesh Kodashim, which is the DNA. You can see it in the nucleus. So on the lower part of the slide with the purple thing, that is the Kodesh Kodashim. No one's allowed to get in there. That is where the DNA is. It never leaves. The DNA does not leave the nucleus. So how would it send its messages out to the rest of the cell? The DNA encodes for protein synthesis. We need to make between 25 and 30,000 proteins in our body. I'll give you an example. If one drinks milk and you have lactose in the milk, we need to make a protein called lactase. Lactase is an enzyme, which is a protein, a form of protein, and we need to make that to break down the lactose. Those individuals who are lactose intolerant are individuals generally who do not have the letter coding that would allow them to produce that protein. So the instruction booklet is in that DNA in the series of letters. It's inside that Kodesh Kodashim, and now we have to get it out to the more general area. What it does to protect itself, it stays in the nucleus, and it makes a messenger RNA, an mRNA. That mRNA is a complement to the DNA. As you can see, every time in the blue on the right, there's an A, there's a U in the mRNA. If there's a C in the blue, there's a G, and so on and so forth. So the information encoded in the DNA is now encoded in the red strand, which is the messenger RNA. The messenger RNA, that is the shaliach that is allowed to leave the Kodesh Kodashim and get out to the rest of the cell. What does it do there? It is read letter by letter by letter by the ribosomal structure. That is the round tan thing that you see. Imagine the old days of cassette tapes. You had a reel of 2 spools of tape, and it would pass over a magnetic head, which would read the information and play the music. This is kind of what's happening here. You have a long strand of mRNA. It is passing through. It is reading each one of these letters. and it goes 3 letters at a time. Each 3 letters is what we call a codon, which translates into a Lego block. We call these Lego blocks amino acids. And what proteins are polypeptides. They are made of multiple amino acids, and we string them all together in order to make a full protein. What is the code? We know the code, and now if we can move the zoom back on the right, you can see the code on the lower left. We can see that the first codon in this red is UGG. Let us look it up in the table. First letter on the left axis here is U, so we'll use the top left there. The second letter is U again. G. Let's go to the right side of the top. So now we're in the rightmost uppermost box, UG. Third letter in this case of the codon is G. So we'll go to UGG in that upper right box, if everyone can see that. And that translates to the amino acid of TRP. We now see
the
that—
president speaking. The president sought to speak.
Okay, let's take a moment and watch that. Ricky, do you want to put that live?
Jack, since you're sharing, you have the screen. You want to put it on your YouTube? Share it?
Okay.
That was lucky or through talent or through luck, or whatever you want. But through a very collective action and shared sacrifice, national determination, we will overcome the threat of the virus. I also announced Wednesday night, following the advice of our—
Which one's the live one?
Suspending the entry of foreign nationals who have been to Europe in the last 14 days from entering the United
At this point, it sounds like they're just repeating themselves. So, Jack, you can give your reactions, and then you could also mention some of your conversations with Joe Kerry and the community leaders, so that we have a better sense of how it affects us directly in Cuomo's upcoming announcement.
Great. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's very good news, what we just heard. We've been waiting for this. We've been advocating for this. We need the declaration of national emergency. It's critical in a situation like this because what it does is it frees up about $50 billion of federal funding. It frees up FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to direct emergency supplies to hospitals and other locations. It also, as you heard the president say, waives the rules and regulations within hospitals. Hospitals are one of the most regulated buildings on earth, and you're not allowed under normal regulations to take certain parts of the hospital and make them into ICUs. That has now been waived. What Italy had to do, which I'll mention in a few slides, had to take operating rooms and turn them into ICU rooms. This waiver now allows all this flexibility to happen. Our hospitals around the country do not have enough ICU rooms. I'll share some information on that. And they do not have enough negative pressure rooms. A negative pressure room is a room where the air is not pushed out, but stays within the room, so that if a virus is present in the room, it stays and does not infect the entire hospital. We do not have enough of these isolation negative pressure rooms, but now other rooms can be made into negative pressure rooms with appropriate equipment. So it does a lot of things in terms of waiving those kinds of rules and regulations, and it takes care of a host of other things. On the testing side, 1.4 million is a good start, but I would say that we're gonna need a lot more. If you look at the kind of testing that is happening in China or Singapore, it's at greater scale per capita than 1.4 million. The good news is he said that there'll be eventually available 5 million tests. And if you think about 327 million Americans trying to squeeze into 1.4 million tests, that's going to be a problem. So given that the epidemiologists predict a penetration rate of at least 90 million Americans getting infected, some of the models that came out of CDC earlier today were leaked out, getting up to maybe 150, 160 million Americans infected. Even if we go with the lower number, let's go with 90 million infected, that's still going to be a lot more than 1.4 million people who will need to be tested. So I think it's a really good start, and I'm really glad that the administration turned around on this in terms of their initial stance that there was nothing wrong and we can go about our business, to this stance now. So I think this is really, really good news. This announcement today will save a lot of lives. Now the question is, can we get the states to participate? What was missing in today's announcement were some of the NPIs. So my hope is that the hint I'm hearing from the administration is that maybe they're developing some of the NPIs, which I'll describe in a few moments. So it sounds like today was really about the testing, the Google website, the private sector. I think it's great news that Walgreens and Walmart are going to set up labs in their parking lots. The nightmare scenario would have been that the government tries to do it itself and people have long lines out of some government building in downtown Manhattan or something like that. That would have been like a disaster. The fact that we can have Walgreens and Walmarts, and there will be long lines at those facilities, but you'll need a ticket, I believe, some kind of number to go and be eligible for that. So you can't just walk into Walgreens. That's what the website is there for. What they're trying to do is to discourage panic testing. What they don't want is people just having a cough and just literally going to get tested. So they're trying to get down the panic testing, I think, which is a good thing. So anyway, that's a quick read on that. When we come back to it, when we go through some more slides, I think we'll get more context for that. So let me just pick off where we dropped off, which is on this slide here. Let me make it big again for folks. Okay, so I think we were just finishing up on the DNA to RNA to amino acid. The bottom line on this slide is the following. Our DNA sits in the nucleus. It has the encoding of what proteins we need, such as lactase, 25,000 other proteins that we need to live for our body. It does not leave the nucleus. It sends a messenger, the mRNA, with that message. That messenger RNA goes into the ribosomal complex and gets read like a tape. And each 3 letters together form a codon. The code that we now know in the table on the lower left tells us how it strings together these amino acids. Amino acids together are a protein, and that protein has function in our body. These are the things we need to live. So going back up, we can see that the RNA virus, which again is more insidious than a DNA virus in that it skips over a whole step, it does not have to go into the nucleus. It does not have to change the DNA. It's one person I was presenting to called it the con man. It comes in as a con man, says, hi, I'm the messenger RNA. I have the message from the nucleus, from the DNA. Of course, it doesn't. It has its own message that it worked up on its own. What does it mean that it's a positive strand, positive sense strand RNA? Positive sense means that it's ready to go and can make the ribosome, which is that purple little snowman-like thing that you see here, can read it right away. If it's a negative sense RNA virus, then it would have to make a complement to itself, and then the ribosome can read it like a tape. In this case, it's very direct, really quick, and it starts pumping out proteins that it needs. Those are the yellow, blue, and green things that you see just below. That is the proteins that the RNA virus instructs the ribosome to produce. It then uses those proteins and some cellular components to make the VRC, the viral replication complex. The VRC is a factory that takes the single red strand that has entered into the cell and is able to replicate like a Xerox machine, thousands to hundreds of thousands to ultimately millions of itself. You see those happening. So we go down, we go to the right, and we go up. The 3 copies that you see there, of course, it's many more than 3. It encapsulates them. That is, it puts another Trojan horse in covering around them, egresses them out of the cell to then infect more of the human cells that are right nearby. So because this attacks the lung cells, the alveolar cells, it goes into 1. It starts with 1. It goes to 3, goes to 5. Those 5 go to, each one goes to 5. Now you're at 25, then you're at 125, then you're at 1,000, then you're at 5,000, then you're at 100,000. So when we call it a virus and we say something goes viral, it's both going viral through the population. It's also going viral in that body. It happens very, very quickly. And this is why both in SARS-1 and in certain cases here, people can die very quickly. Because particularly if they have respiratory issues already, if they have cardiovascular respiratory issues, meaning that they already have issues getting the oxygen to where it needs to go, then they're going to have a major problem here, because suddenly huge swaths of the lung cells are no longer available to do their job. They're in fact doing the job of the virus. That is one of the core problems that we're facing over here. So with that, let me now show you a different view, a diagram here of the virus. You can see on the left how it looks in terms of its generally spherical shape. And then if you cut it open, you'll see you have the spike proteins on the left and right, and you also have the RNA, that single-stranded positive sense RNA that's hiding inside. These glycoproteins, these spike proteins you see spiking out, are what connect to the ACE receptor, ACE receptor. You might ask me, why the lungs? How does it know to go to the lungs? Why is it impacting the lungs, first and foremost? The answer is that the highest concentration of ACE receptors, ACE receptors in our body is on the surface of our lungs internally. This is what the spike glycoprotein is able to fit into, like a lock and a key. And that allows it ingress into the cell. If another part of the body also had ACE receptors, it would also affect that. But this is the primary place in our body that it has those. Viruses look for ways to enter into a cell and hijack its machinery. The virus is not looking to grab sugar and things like that. That's not what it's after. It's looking for its survival. And to survive, it needs to replicate its own RNA in this case. So one possible attack on this for a drug treatment would be to cover those glycoproteins, to make some kind of drug that would attach onto the top of the glycoprotein like a cap and not allow it to get into the ACE receptor that's on the surface of our lung cells. We don't have such a drug yet, but let's see what happens. Just a couple of notes here. The coronavirus that we're talking about is specifically part of a genus of beta coronavirus, which is part of a subfamily, and then of course the family Coronaviridae. There's many coronaviruses out there. 7 in particular we'll focus on here. The first 4 are pretty innocuous and at this point do not cause a lot of harm to us. Most of us on this call have at least the first one. This was first found in the 60s as it's penetrated across America. Most Americans have this coronavirus. If you get it for the first time, you probably get some cold symptoms. And in that sense, it's similar to the rhinovirus, which is the general virus that attacks us, that gives us a cold. But this is another way to get cold symptoms, is through the 229E, the alpha coronavirus. The MERS is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, and that was mainly relegated to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and some other Middle Eastern countries. It killed very, very fast and very deadly. And so the only upside to those kinds of viruses is that they snuff themselves out very quickly. People separate out into hospital and they're not able to transmit it to lots of other people. SARS-CoV-1, or just SARS-CoV as it's called, was 2003. Severe acute respiratory syndrome. Like this, attacks the lungs, very severe. When you get infected, it's very, very apparent with symptoms. So the 8,000 people that got infected in 2003 immediately separated out of society into hospital. 800 died, 10% fatality rate. But again, that meant that it did not go across the world. SARS-CoV-2 is insidious on several respects. First, many of us will never get symptoms, even if infected. Therefore, people go about their business if they're not practicing NPI, non-pharmaceutical interventions, and they are infecting many, many other people. The lawyer in New Rochelle had no symptoms, and generally speaking, even if people develop symptoms, they will have no symptoms for the first between 5 and 10 days. Sometimes, in some cases, we hear reports from the medical community up to 14 days. The average is 5 to 6 days. So that's 5 days that that person believes they're fine, no suspicion they're infected, and are infecting many other people. That's the first part. Of course, we have no immunity to this. People often ask, why is this different than influenza, than the flu that we see every year? A few key differences. First, we vaccinate for the flu. Out of 330 million people in America, we vaccinate 150 million of them every single year, primarily the vulnerable populations, older people and others. That means that it stops the spread, the widespread nature of the flu. Because if you are infected and you're around 5 people, the chances are that at least 2 of those have been vaccinated, perhaps even 3. And that means that they're a blocker and they're not going to keep transmitting it in a viral fashion. Also, I should mention that the death fatality rate of influenza, of the flu, is only 0.1%, a tenth of 1%. This is higher, as we'll see in a few moments. Beta coronavirus is the genus that I mentioned before under the family Coronaviridae. And let's look at the timeline. The 60s is when we first discovered these. SARS-CoV-1 was in 2003, 2004 was in Netherlands, 2005 the Hong Kong version was found, and then MERS in the Middle East, and then now SARS-CoV-2. Disease spread terms. Endemic just means that if you have a particular disease where there's a population that is known to have that particular disease, but it's not spreading out anywhere, it's not going viral, it's endemic to that particular population. An outbreak is a more generic term that means it's starting to break out in some kind of spike. An epidemic is a sudden increase, but still mainly localized to 1 or 2 regions. And then, of course, this was upgraded 2 days ago to pandemic status. And pandemic means that it's now affecting large numbers of people, but also the other criterion is that it's across multiple continents. Quarantine versus isolation are often used interchangeably, and it's fine if people do that, but just to let you know how the medical professionals use it, they say to quarantine a well person and isolate an ill person. So you may hear that, and if you see that in communications for the medical community, you'll see how they're using it. R0, as it's said in Europe, or R0, is the average number of people that an infected person will infect. So if that New Rochelle lawyer is infected, how many people on average would a person like that infect? R0, the experts tell us, goes down over time. So the R0 we're about to look at is the steady state R0. R0 initially, of course, is very high. That lawyer probably infected 10 or 20 people at least. Those 10, 20 people infected 10 to 20 people each, and then it went viral, of course, and 1,000 people plus are on lockdown in New Rochelle with the National Guard. That's because initially no one is infected, and therefore that initial infected person has an opportunity to infect a lot of people. But over time, of course, more and more people are infected. If 90 million people get infected in America, that means that there'll essentially be many infected people around that infected person. There's no opportunity to reinfect that person. So that's the R0. This is a key slide. This is the epidemiological model by Dr. James Lawler. James Lawler is one of the key MDs that is the advisor to the American Hospital Association. The Hospital Association is the hospitals and the heads of medical for all the major hospitals in America. And they have 2 or 3 key advisors, of which James Lawler is one. He is one of our direct advisors and experts to our effort in our community. We have spoken with him many times. He gave us this information directly, and we were able to confer with him throughout the past 10 days. So we're very appreciative to Dr. Lawler for taking his time to do that. He believes that we will see a steady state R0 of 2.5. Of course, we're at much higher R0s right now. If there's someone infected in our community, for example, and goes to a synagogue or goes to a school, they will infect a lot more than 2.5 people. This is a steady state after a few months when many, many people are infected. Doubling time, initially Dr. Lawler believed that it was 7 to 10 days. He now believes it's coming down to 5 or 6 days. Of course, doubling times and R0s are slightly different in every region of the world, and even in a country as big as ours, will be different in different states. If we say there's a doubling rate of every 5 days, that means that if you have 100 the first day, 5 days later you have 200, 5 days after that you have 400, 5 days after that you have 800. In the same block of time, you have a doubling. It doesn't take double the time, it's the same amount of time, but double the cases. This is the problem. This is what we're facing and why we have to slow this virus down. Community attack rate of 30+%. Let's define that. Epidemiologists such as James Lawler believe and have shown the data from previous pandemics and epidemics that although in theory the virus should hit 100% of the people, and sometimes over many, many decades it might, such as the initial alpha coronaviruses from the 60s. Initially, in the first wave, it does not do so. There's several reasons for that, but let's just assume right now that we have just above a 30% penetration rate and that it plateaus after that. That is still 96 million cases. That is where the 96 million comes in. Other models from the CDC that were released today in some articles that came out this morning indicate that other epidemiologists believe that the attack rate could be higher. And that's why you see numbers of 150 million or 160 million people ultimately infected. Infected, again, just means that someone now harbors the virus. It does not mean they're showing symptoms. It does not mean that they're sick. But they do have the virus, and they are contagious. They can infect other people. You do not have to show symptoms to infect other people. This has now been verified in other countries and in this country. James Lawler believes that cases requiring hospitalization will be 5%. That's where you get the 4.8 million admissions. ICU, 1 to 2%. That's the 1.9 million ICU. And cases requiring ventilatory support is 1% or 1 million positive pressure ventilators. A ventilator is a machine that breathes for you. God forbid if somebody has the situation where they cannot breathe because of this virus, or of course, heart attacks or other kinds of conditions, they must be put on a ventilator immediately. There's two types of interactions with the ventilator with the patient. Intubation, which means that a tube is put down the throat and the air is forced at high pressure into the throat so that the oxygen can get in there. While our general air has 21% oxygen, in the case of this kind of intubation, generally speaking, the EMTs and or the doctors in a hospital would crank up the oxygen so that every breath of air going in would have a higher concentration of oxygen. In any case, you need a ventilator to make this happen. Unfortunately, in our country, there's only 330,000 ICU beds for the 1.9 million people that in this model will need it. And there's only 100,000 ventilators in America for the 1 million people that will need ventilators. This is a critical problem. So beyond the virus itself and the fact that the virus itself, in the best case scenario that we had ventilators for everybody and that we had ICUs for everybody, people would still die due to their vulnerabilities. We are going to have, as Italy has right now, excess deaths if we don't somehow address this issue. The CFR is the case fatality rate. James Lawler believes that the case fatality rate here might be a steady state of 0.5%. So you might say, Jack, how can we see other countries with much higher fatality rates? 7%, 3.4%, so on and so forth. Answer, what James is doing is taking the total fatalities divided by the 96 million, not the number of people who have tested positive. So the numbers you see in the coming slides when I show the tested positive that are being drawn from the web live, that's a different number than the attack rate or the total number of infected. So let's just keep that in mind. Let me come back though to this later in terms of how we can possibly bend this curve. I won't spend time on this slide because this is really just about the R naught on the lower axis, the horizontal axis, and the fatality rate. But you can see again why Ebola did not run across the entire planet, because it killed so many people so quickly. Initially, the kill rate was about 80%. Once they got a sense of how to treat it, they brought it down to 40 to 50%. Very, very deadly, very hard to spread because that population now is missing. ICU beds available. When I send around this deck, you can click on the link below this slide, and you can find out for yourself that New York State only has about roughly 4,000 or so ICU beds, plus a few extra, so call it 4,500. That's New York State. We might have about 25 to 30, 35% of those. And we now have a different number that just came in for the New York, New Jersey area. I'll be sharing those around in another slide as well. So when you get a link to this slide deck, it keeps updating, so keep coming back to it. There's always more information. The point being that I think we can all do the math. If 1.9 million people in America need an ICU bed, and obviously a large portion of those will be in New York, New Jersey area, and we only have a few thousand ICU beds in the New York, New Jersey area, that is a problem. So this is the major concern that we have in terms of preventing deaths over the next few months. The capacity in Italy was 600 ICU beds. In Lombardy, in the northern part of Italy, which is the Milan area and related areas, they were able to surge up to 800 ICU beds by doing that strategy I mentioned before, taking operating theaters and turning them into ICU areas. That means that many people who needed surgery are not going to get surgery. Of course, emergency surgeries probably were done, but anyone who could wait a few days is probably waiting a few days, including cancer patients. They also had to set up 432 medical tents to enable more of the patients to be treated. However, those medical tents generally don't have ventilators and don't have other equipment. And obviously, one does not have the same survival rate in a medical tent as in a full-blown ICU bed. They have tried to turn away people in their most hard-hit areas. In some of the most hard-hit hospitals, we have confirmation from doctors there that people 65 and older have been turned away. The triage decision was made that people under 65 had a better chance of survival and they would get the ventilator. We want to prevent that in our country. Spread of COVID, you can watch this later. This is just an animation. When you get to this slide, as you look at the deck on your own, you can click on the updating and it'll update live. Right now, you see the numbers there. Johns Hopkins, the website, if you're familiar with that, has a great panel and dashboard, but it only is updated once a day. The Worldometer that I pulled from in the previous slide is updated 3 times a day, so you'll see a difference in the numbers. Top 10 countries outside of China, we can see what's happening there, and if you keep updating, you'll see the spread and the numbers increasing. I should mention that Italy only had a few thousand cases about 10 days ago. So unfortunately, we're seeing that spread. 328 cases in New York, and this needs to be updated now because there has been a death on the Upper West Side in a nursing home, but Washington State, which is Seattle, mainly in the Seattle area, has now been doubling about every 6 days. We see a doubling in the Seattle numbers. In terms of the disease itself, you may have seen some numbers about the elderly, and the president just mentioned it, and others have mentioned it, and it is true that the elderly have been more susceptible to fatality with this particular disease. But to get more deep into that, it's the comorbidity that's the real problem. So a very healthy 80-year-old is not really at risk as much as somebody who might be younger, but has one of these comorbidities. Let's define morbidity, of course, and remember the definition of morbidity as having a disease. Mortality is a fatality. Comorbidity means that when someone gets this SARS-CoV-2 virus and infected with it, they already have one of these other diseases. And you can see that the increase in fatality rates is quite dramatic. In this particular analysis, they were assuming a 0.9% no pre-existing conditions fatality rate, not the 0.5% that we just saw before, so slightly different model. But in 0.9%, there was a comorbidity. If there's comorbidity of cardiovascular disease, there's a 10x fatality percentage compared to without the cardiovascular disease. This is why we must protect the vulnerable in our community. We must think about those who are not only having these different conditions, and of course, many old people, and that's why you saw the previous chart, have these conditions, but we know people who are 23 years old who have asthma or respiratory conditions. We know people of all ages with other types of conditions. Anyone who's immunocompromised, who recently got off chemotherapy or any other kind of immunocompromising situation, these are going to be very vulnerable in our community. It's critical that we protect them. And the way to protect them is through NPIs. This was developed formally in 2005 and 2006 by one of the key experts that has been available to us and has been working very closely with us. In fact, he was one of the medical doctors that was on the phone both on Wednesday night with 110 schools and synagogues and centers, and also on the phone with us through many other calls with leaders to explain to them the gravity of the situation and what has to happen. Dr. Carter Metcher, who is that co-author of the NPIs, was tasked by the White House in 2005 and 2006 to develop a set of protocols to prepare for such an event as today. This was just after the 2003 SARS outbreak. And so the White House wanted to make sure that we had an appropriate level of plan. What Dr. Metcher and others realized, looking back on the data from 1918 and other pandemics and epidemics, is that the key was to take action early. When St. Louis, back in 1918, took action early, it saved itself compared to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. In 1918, 27% of the entire population of the globe was infected with the Spanish flu. 500 million people out of about 1.7 billion people were infected. 500 million people were infected. 50 million people lost their lives, 10% fatality rate. In St. Louis, there were some deaths. However, they were far lower in percentage terms of population than Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. St. Louis enacted its NPI 2 weeks before Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Not 2 months, not 3 months, not 5 months, 2 weeks. And so time is important. That's because of the doubling rate. If something starts doubling and starts doubling through multiple people, it cannot be contained and very hard to mitigate. This is why this separation NPI approaches are so effective. When you get the slide deck, you can click on this link. You can read the full program of NPI. Non-pharmaceutical interventions, we call them non-pharmaceutical interventions because, of course, we don't have pharmaceuticals right now. We'll talk in a few minutes about some potential pharmaceuticals that may become available next year, but we don't have those today. What we have today is the ability to control the spread through our own behaviors and actions. We don't have to just roll over and let this thing hit us. We can control this kind of activity. We want to take it from the spike that you see in these 4 graphs from 4 different articles and papers to the flattened type of shape that you see to the right of that. And if you look at the lower left one, the Carl Bergstrom one, you can see that there's a line for every society of what saturates the medical system, ICU beds, ventilators, and so on and so forth. And we want to make sure that we spread it out over time so that we lower it below the medical saturation point. This is the purpose of NPIs. We can see what Israel is doing. Israel closed all schools and universities, K through 12 and universities. Israel has banned the gathering of 100 or more people in any one place. Israel has banned flights coming, anyone coming into the country effectively, because if you are Israeli, you probably want to go back to the country if you wish to, and you'd have a 2-week quarantine, self-imposed quarantine. But essentially, it's killed off its tourism industry for the next upcoming months, because obviously tourists do not want to spend 2 weeks in quarantine and then go start having some kind of vacation. The guidance and NPI coming from Dr. Metcher is the following. You can read the whole thing on the PDF, but this boils down to this. We need folks to stay home if they're coughing or sneezing, any kind of symptoms. It doesn't matter if it's the exact symptoms or not the exact symptoms. We need people to stay home. People in the household are sick, including a housekeeper. They need to stay home, even if you're not sick. Close schools and daycares is very clear. St. Louis did it. Others did it. Hong Kong just did it. People ask me, how come Singapore didn't have to do that? Singapore was hardest hit with the SARS virus of 2003. The Singaporeans, with their technology, built an infrastructure that is second to none. Public health infrastructure that includes lab test facilities that are able to make a lab test in under 24 hours, which they did. They then tested many of the people at the rate of 10,000 people a day, starting right off the bat. As of today, prior to the president's announcement, no more than 6,000 humans in America were tested, total, United States of America. Singapore's been testing 10,000 people a day. Singapore is a state in which its citizens give access to social media, keys to the government, and therefore the government is allowed to go into social media in emergency cases and find out all the friends of that person, track them down, test them, isolate them, move them, so on and so forth. We do not have such capabilities in the United States of America. We do not have facilities that they have in Singapore. We do not have the isolation facilities they set up in their hospitals. We do not have the lab tests that they set up right away. Because of that, they have contained their virus. We unfortunately did not prepare in the way that they did. However, the distancing that we're talking about should have a major impact. Distancing in the community, in the workplace, although the term that's been used in the actual documents is social distancing. I like talking about physical distancing, but social connecting like we are over Zoom today. So hopefully we can stay socially connected, but physically distancing. But you will see the term social distancing. Events and meetings of no more than 20 people. We should not be congregating with any more than 20 people. This includes weddings. Already many of the community are taking responsible action, and they're postponing weddings and or having a small wedding of 20 people or so in the home, and then having a larger reception at some other time. This is the responsible thing to do. Telecommuting to work where possible. We know that Amazon, Google, Facebook, and many other companies around the country have now said it is not optional to telecommute It is mandatory. Google, 120,000 people worldwide, 65,000 people in America and North America generally. The North American offices have been closed. Many offices around the world have been closed. We cannot go into the office. These are critical steps that we must take to slow down the spread of this virus. They work. They've been shown to work in this very viral outbreak. We don't have to look back just to 1918. We can compare Hong Kong and we can compare that with Italy. Has Italy now closed its schools? It has. Has Italy closed all of its churches? Italy is one of the most religious countries in all of Europe, the Catholic religion. They have closed all churches. Unfortunately, they did it 5 to 6 weeks too late. That is the difference. That is the difference. We have some information here about the genomic lineage. I'll just say that we do now have the complete sequence of the 26,000 letters that make up this particular virus, that RNA I was showing you before. You will see some reports. There was a report in the Telegraph in the UK that there's a mutation splitting off into the L type and the S type. We have confirmed with Trevor Bedford, what we believe to be one of the foremost geneticists on this. He's based in Seattle at Ground Zero of Seattle. He is a geneticist and has had a lab there for almost 20 years in the Fred Hutchinson Center, Research Center, and he is tracking 300 plus sequences taken from samples around the world. He has samples from Wuhan, from the Ground Zero. He has samples from Italy, from Lombardy. He has samples from other parts of Europe and different parts of the United States. He's been able to track the spread of this genetically, genomically. He says that there is an L and S type. However, there's no functional difference between the two. You can see that in one case, there's a C at particular spot 8782 in open reading frame 1AB. That's just a technical way of saying a spot, an address on this long chain of 26,000 letters, but there's no functional difference. This is the genomic sequence. Okay, let's now get to the medicines. Oh, I should mention that there are 60 plus clinical trials happening right now, mostly in China. My personal opinion, this is not the opinion of any particular person, and no one really knows, but my personal opinion from speaking to many of the experts is that the Chinese will probably come up with a solution first, both in terms of a vaccine and a treatment. Some of these trials may yield one of those, for example. Will they give it to the rest of the world? We don't know, but they don't have some of the hurdles that we have with our FDA in terms of getting through the FDA and approval systems in order to get it out to the people. We believe they're fast tracking this and should have something probably before the end of the year, probably maybe even by November. Whereas we in our country and Europe probably can at best see something in February or March. Vaccines in development: Moderna, GSK, CureVac, Johnson & Johnson, Sanofi, and Vir. Moderna was the first out of the block to announce that it has a candidate for a vaccine. It needs to recruit patients now, 45 patients minimum, for an April start of a trial. That takes some time. If that goes well, trial phase 1, then they have to go to phase 2. Then they will be given approval. And again, by February, March, they have to start manufacturing. How does one manufacture a vaccine? Unfortunately, there's no machine that can make a vaccine. They are made in eggs of chickens. Chicken eggs are the host of developing and growing a vaccine. This is a problem. It takes a while to do so. People are looking at ways to accelerate this, but this is not something that can be pumped out in the order of 100 million overnight. CureVac and others, you can read that when you get the slide deck, are working on these as well. I just want to finish with 1 or 2 slides. South Korea, which has been putting in place NPIs. They also have better tracking of individual cases, I should mention, is been able to now to have a decrease in the number of new positives a day. They don't have full containment, but they have made progress. I should also mention that the pandemic, why was it called the Spanish flu? Which is an interesting fact. It actually was not Spanish in terms of origin, nor did they have the most cases, but Europe was at war at that time, of course, World War I, and neither the German side nor the British side wanted to admit that they were being attacked by this flu. They felt it was a weakness to show to the other side. And the Spanish, who were neutral in that war, decided to announce its numbers and be transparent with its numbers. So everyone started calling it the Spanish flu. But the more important aspect is that, again, St. Louis versus other cities were very different in how they practice this. The St. Louis and other Midwestern cities had a natural barrier, of course, being distant, and they're able to put a cordon around their particular cities. Philly and others started the NPI practices too late at the height of the threat that this occurred, and that was too late, about 2 weeks too late. So with that, let me pause. I should mention one paper that we've seen come out more recently, analyzing that coronavirus and can exist on surfaces and live on surfaces. This means that if you have a visitor to your home and that person may be infected, we don't know, and touches various surfaces such as kitchen counters and flat surfaces like that, does not really apply to cardboard. It looks like packages coming from overseas or China do not look like they can carry the virus on them. But if it's a flat surface, then it can harbor the virus and live there for between 5 and 9 days. So it's very important that we continue to both clean our surfaces as well as our hands. With that, let me pause and see if there's any questions. Maybe have to give people, I don't know, mute, unmute capabilities.
I have a question for you. If you hear me.
Yeah, Michael?
Yes. Hi. After you get over the virus, let's say you had symptoms and you get over the symptoms, are you still contagious?
We asked the doctor that, the several doctors that we work with, and they said minimally. What they mean by that is they're not willing to say zero, but they say that if one got through it, and that means that, again, there's no treatment for it, that means that your immune system was able to find a way to start fighting that virus. That means that your immune system now has some memory of how it did that. And therefore, one, you should have some immunity to the exact kind of virus that you were infected with. I want to give an asterisk on that in a second. And then you should not be transmitting to others because you have now effectively wiped it out of your system. Again, they can't give us a 100% assurance on that because some of it could be still harbored in your body, but they believe that your ability to transmit goes down by a tremendous percentage. In terms of the asterisk, this particular virus, Trevor has been tracking it out of his lab in Seattle, as I mentioned, and it is mutating. The mutations so far have no functional difference. They're not making it more aggressive or less aggressive. If it mutates too much, that means that the same person who overcame it in one particular bout could actually get infected again and get sick again. Now, of course, this happens every year. We know that people who were vaccinated for flu vintage 2018 should take another vaccine 2 years later because it's a different genomic vintage. And the people in public health try to go out every year, try to figure out what the genomic makeup will be of the flu that year and try to make a vaccine that is as close as possible to that. So that is what we've asked the doctors, and that's the information they have in the last 24 hours.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any questions about the NPIs or how to implement the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions?
I have a question about, like visiting parents or elderly.
Yeah.
We know a lot in large gatherings, but what about smaller gatherings?
Yeah. We asked the doctors this question. You heard the president say that they are now barring any non-medically required visits to old age homes and elderly homes and senior citizen homes. So he just made that announcement just now, which I think is a wise decision. We've asked the doctors this question as well, where, again, the doctors are advising us extreme caution. What they're saying to us is that those who are vulnerable, and again, absolutely, the elderly are vulnerable for the reasons that we talked about, but let's also remember that if someone has a cousin who has diabetes, if someone has a relative who has respiratory issues, asthma or other such respiratory issues, they are also at risk, and we must put them in the same category here. So if one is to visit one's parents, grandparents, or other people in these categories, what the doctors tell us is to practice extreme caution. Upon entering, every household should have wipes or disinfectant so that the person entering can cleanse themselves immediately. The person entering should take cautions to keep some distance from that relative. And if one is going to have a dinner together or a lunch together, to keep some distance. We're trying to discourage people from having our usual types of Friday night situations where we're 25 people packed on the same table. If we can find folding tables, other tables, and have the same number of people spread out over a larger space, and so that as we're speaking and something might come out of our mouth, even microscopically, and go into the food of other people or touch other people or any other way affect other people, we can minimize these kinds of interactions. I think it's unrealistic to say that one should not visit, one's relatives. So I think if that does happen, the doctors are telling us that we should really try to be, very, very careful. I was on the phone with the Jewish community in London this week, and one family I was speaking to told me that they've taken their parents, sent them to some home in the beach side of England, and they're not going to visit them for about 2 months. So it's sad in terms of the family not visiting them, but they're FaceTiming and they're videoing and things like that. So again, no one has the exact answer on that, but the doctors are cautioning us to really try to minimize. Now, of course, by taking the aggressive NPI actions that we need to take, closing schools and shuls and things like that. When I say aggressive, I don't mean they're overly protective. I mean, this is the thing we have to do. We are minimizing, hopefully, the ability for the virus to get into us, and therefore our ability to transmit it to our loved ones. People have asked the question in other forums, how long will this last in terms of these NPIs? We don't have an answer to that. I would like to set expectations, though, that this is not going to be a few weeks. Some schools call me up and say, oh, we can open up in 2 weeks. We can absolutely open up right after Pesach. There is no guarantee for that. People should be thinking about this in longer terms. We should kind of just pull the Band-Aid off and not Chinese water torture this. That's my personal recommendation to folks when you're speaking to your families. Let's not say to them, well, it'll just pass and we'll be fine in a few weeks, because then people will get more disappointed and more depressed. And one thing that the doctors caution us and advise us on is mental health. We must think about the mental health of ourselves and of our people and our families. This is very, very stressful. We know that on the positive side, social bonds give us positive endorphins and positive feelings. And we're now removing many of those. And so we need to replace that and be overactive in terms of replacing that. In my company, for example, one of our coworkers has opened up a full-time 24/7 video chat that anyone can drop in on at any time. It's like a Zoom call that's going on 24/7. You can just join anytime you want to and have kind of do water cooler chat with people in your company. There are other best practices that people are thinking about in terms of having a support group of friends who have agreed to get together once a week for nothing other than the agenda of just sharing what's going on. So let's be proactive in our communities and in our families around that. If you have an extended family, as we all do, you may want to gather them on some kind of periodic basis and talk to them and to share things. So mental health is very, very critical. The doctors tell us, of course, and we need to think about that. Immune system function goes down with lower mental health. So we need to think about the depressive state that this can put us in, the lower state that this can put us in. I should mention, my brother asked me to speak about some of the work we're doing with some of the leaders of the community. We've been able to gather, Morris Bailey and Joe Carey and Jeff Sutton and Joe Sid and others and start working together. Putting out messages. There should be an email out perhaps already from those four and others, going out to the community, encourage them on these NPIs. We are encouraging schools and others to, basically come onto the NPI program. We're also working very closely with the Ashkenaz communities. And so Dr. Dchek, who many of you heard on Wednesday night, is very close with many of the communities, and he and I have been a tag team duo with the other doctors to go to these communities and speak to them and convince them to come on board. It is difficult for some of the communities because they don't have the same technology penetration as our community has. We've done surveys now, as recently as the Mag and David survey that went out yesterday, and realized that there's a pretty good high penetration of laptops in the community for distance learning, but other communities do not have this penetration, and distance learning is more difficult. And so we're thinking about how to help these communities to understand that this is critical for all of us. We can't have just one community and not other communities do this. We need to make sure everyone does. It could be the case that Governor Cuomo in the next few days is able to increase the level of preparedness for our state, in which case he may actually get to the point where he helps close the schools. I don't know if it'll be from Cuomo or de Blasio. There's an increasing amount of pressure on de Blasio to close the New York City public schools. And this has been a cause of great concern for us. So, you know, these are fast-moving times, but I think that there's really no need for panic. It's really about preparedness. The analogy that I use is being on the top of a large snow mountain at a ski resort and looking down at a double diamond, black diamond ski run. Now, if you've never skied before, it's going to be really, really bad and ugly. But if you're prepared, at least you know you're going to get to the bottom. It's going to be a little bumpy, but you're going to get to the bottom. I think that we must do all we can to prepare for this downhill slope that we're going down, and we must do everything possible. This empowers us, and what we can say to our families is that we're doing everything possible to protect them and to do what's possible to make sure the medical resources are there for us when, God forbid, someone should need that. So that's the aim of the program, and that's why we're spreading this information, sharing it from Dr. Carter Metcher, from Dr. Lawler, from Dr. Dchek, and others. I'll share the deck around. Please use the deck. And if there are any questions over the next days, weeks, please email me. My email is jack@hidary.com. Easy to remember, jack@hidary.com. Or reach out to me through my brother or the synagogue, and we'd be happy to answer more questions. If people want to have a further conversation with some of the doctors on the video, we'd be happy to arrange that with a day or so of notice. We can get them on video. We can go from there. But with that, I now will make another presentation to another community, and but thank you very much for listening today. Rick, I can't hear you.
Are you taking any more questions?
Jack, another question?
Go ahead.
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Are you talking about preparation for the future? Water and toilet paper aren't the things that I see in the immediate future that I need, even though that seems to be on the news. But considering a 4 to 8 week window ahead of us, as a father of a family or of a business, what are some of the preparations that I should have in mind for that kind of extended period of isolation or quarantine? Are there things that you've thought through or had a chance to think through that might be more of a necessity
Sure.
going forward?
Yeah, I've asked the doctors and I've asked others and tried to start assembling some ideas on that. I have to go right now because these guys are waiting for me, but just to answer briefly, I would think about several things, and let's definitely think about more than 4 to 8 weeks. I don't want anyone to have false expectations. I hope that it will be short, but will probably be longer than that. I just want to set expectations on that. One thing to think about is, God forbid, if anybody needs to go to the hospital, what would you want to have with you? You want to have charged battery chargers, those battery packs that you can buy them now, charge them up at all times, keep them in the wall, or keep them charged, so that if you, God forbid, had to run with somebody to take care of them or be with them or in any way look over them, you have your power with you.
But that means you're questioning the power of possible infrastructure of the city, power, water.
No. The power's not going down.
Right.
But if you have to go to a clinic or hospital, it's going to be overrun there. There'll be no place to charge your phone. These are just the details, but the details are important. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. In terms of your family, what you want to do is you want to make sure that there may be supply chain interruptions over the next 3 months. By supply chain interruption, I'm saying that as drivers of trucks who bring food, as other kinds of means of conveying the food from farm to where we are disrupted, perhaps in some cases because some people might get sick, other people may not be able to receive it. I think we can anticipate some disruptions there. So if you could, have some stock, not crazy amounts of stock, but some stock of the necessities of food, particularly, that would be a good thing. Long shelf life food that you would eat anyway. So there's no wastage here. Let's not buy too much that we're going to waste. But if we can have enough food for this period, that would be great. And we want to make sure that we keep, the number one thing is to keep everyone very healthy. Keep your immune system up. Sleep well. What I do, I'm not a doctor. I'm not telling you that you should do this. I'm just telling you that what I do, and I travel a lot, as many of us do. I go, before this whole thing, I travel about 200 days of the year. I'm on planes all the time. My family can tell you that I've not been sick, God bless me, in 10 years. I use emergency. I use a lot of other things that keep my immune system going. This is the time to do that. This is the time to be as healthy as possible. God forbid if someone gets infected, they will not succumb to the symptoms. And it's a time to also think about doing that for our loved ones who may be particularly vulnerable, to make sure that they're as healthy as possible to prepare for this onslaught. So those are some things that I'm thinking about. It's not exhaustive. And perhaps we'll start thinking of a list of things that perhaps we can send around to do that. But let me now jump to the other community. But thank you very much for listening today.
Okay, thank you, Jack. I'm wishing everybody Shabbat Shalom and good health. I'll be sending out a Dvar Torah in a little bit in lieu of the drasha tonight and tomorrow. And we'll be announcing classes, Zoom classes, and other events for the week as we go forth. So please be in touch about what your needs are and how our synagogue can best serve everybody's needs so that we can get through this healthily. And really want to hope everybody enjoys your Shabbat together with your family and have a chance to sit together and pray together and study together with all of your kids. I did record this session, and so if you know someone that missed it that would like to hear it, you can let me know and I'll do my best to share it. Okay, bye everybody.